Shabbat Shalom, family and friends. We are in the 35th Torah portion named Naso, which means elevate. It takes place in the book of Numbers, chapter 4, verse 21, through chapter 7, verse 89. It also includes in the book of Judges, chapter 13, verses 2 through 25. And in the Psalms, the 92nd and 93rd chapters. And in the Renewed Covenant, it includes the book of Acts, chapter 21, verses 17 through 26. So this Torah portion includes a wide array of instructions, and among them is what is known as the Sota ritual. This is the test for a woman suspected of adultery. So the Sota ritual is a divine test for a woman whose husband suspects her of infidelity, though he has no proof. The process includes the woman being brought before the priest. The husband brings a special offering without oil or incense, and this represents sorrow. The priest writes a curse on a scroll and washes it off into bitter water. And the woman drinks the water, and she agrees that if she is guilty, her body would be afflicted. And it specifies how her body would be afflicted, that her belly or side would be swollen, and her thigh would waste away or rot. However, if she is innocent, she is cleared and would be deemed to be fruitful. Now, in looking at this ritual, it does look very similar to what we see in the Gospels as we look at Jesus' crucifixion. Okay, there are parallels between the Sota ritual and Jesus' crucifixion. And this is recognizing that Jesus took the place of the accused bride, absorbing the judgment meant for her. So if we take a step back, Numbers 5:14 speaks of a spirit of jealousy coming upon the husband. God is described as a jealous God. We see that in Exodus 34, from the beginning of the Exodus of the children of Israel leaving Egypt. God notes for the children of Israel not to worship any other God, for he is a jealous God. Then we see later on in the writings of the prophets that Israel is often portrayed as the bride of God who has been unfaithful. We see that in the books of Hosea, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, among others. So all humanity, not just Israel, has been unfaithful to God through sin and idolatry. So let's maybe go through some of these parallels one by one, just to kind of drive this home. One, in Numbers, we see the woman is accused of adultery. In the Gospels, humanity is guilty of spiritual adultery. Okay? In Numbers, the jealous husband brings the accusation. In the Gospel, we see God's righteous jealousy over his covenant people. In Numbers, we see that the bride stands before the priest. In the Gospels, we see Jesus standing before the high priest, as well as Pilate, who's the governmental authority in that place. In Numbers, we see that a curse is written and washed into water. In the Gospel, we see Yeshua bearing, or Jesus bearing, the written curse of the law. In fact, it states in Galatians 3:13 specifically that Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become himself a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. In Numbers, we see the bride or the wife drinking bitter water. In the Gospels, we see that Jesus drank the cup of suffering and wrath. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 39, and this is when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus fell on his face and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Interesting language that he uses. He's referring to a cup. The same way that, as we see in Numbers, that the wife would receive this cup of bitter water. And Jesus voluntarily drank the cup of God's wrath on behalf of the guilty. In fact, we see in the Old Testament, in Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 15, when declaring judgment on Babylon, the Lord, the God of Israel, says, "Take this cup of the wine of wrath from my hand and give it to all the nations to whom I send you to drink from it." Interesting that it's also referring to a cup of wrath. More parallels in Numbers. We see that her guilt or innocence is revealed. In the Gospels, we see that Jesus was innocent but took on our guilt. And then we see in Numbers the result. It's either a curse or a blessing. If she's innocent, she is vindicated and she is blessed. In the Gospels, what do we see? That through his curse we receive blessing. Isaiah 53:5 notes, "He was pierced for our offenses. He was crushed for our wrongdoings. The punishment for our well-being was laid upon him, and by his wounds we are healed." Those are some very interesting parallels between something that was occurring as a ritual way back when, to what we see also way back when, but during the times of the Gospels. And here are some of the key differences between the two, though. In Numbers, we see that it involves a suspicion, but without evidence. In the Gospels, we see that it involves a false accusation on an innocent man who ends up being condemned. In Numbers, we see that the guilty party would suffer the personal consequences. However, we see in the Gospel where Yeshua, who is innocent, suffers on behalf of others' guilt. In Numbers, we see that the woman drinks to prove her innocence or guilt. In the Gospels, we see that Jesus drinks the cup knowing he is innocent, bearing guilt voluntarily. In Numbers, we see that the ritual is limited to one person. In the Gospels, Jesus' act is cosmic and universal, applying to all who believe in him. In Numbers, it's a test by ordeal. In the Gospels, Jesus' crucifixion is a redemptive act, not a test, but it's an atonement. In Numbers, the ritual could end in death, curse, or exoneration. However, in the Gospels, Jesus' death leads to life and blessing for his people. And what is, not to stray away from the Torah portion too much, but what's interesting about Jesus' crucifixion is how many prophecies were fulfilled. In Isaiah 53:7 says that the Messiah would be silent before his accusers, as Jesus was before Pilate. Psalms 22:18 foretells soldiers dividing Messiah's garments, fulfilled at the crucifixion. Psalm 69:21 and Psalm 22:15 predicted the Messiah would be given vinegar and gall, fulfilled when Jesus was offered sour wine. Psalm 34:20 state that none of the Messiah's bones would be broken, fulfilled when Jesus' legs were not broken on the cross, whereas the people next to him, their bones were broken. Isaiah 53:9 prophesies that the Messiah would be buried with the rich, fulfilled by Jesus' burial in in the burial of Joseph of Arimathea. The Sota ritual is not merely an ancient legal procedure. It is a shadow of the cross, where the innocent Messiah drinks the bitter water of judgment to restore the unfaithful bride. And I guess I would like to end with this. Psalm 34:20 and Exodus 12:46 state that none of the Messiah's bones would be broken, fulfilled when Jesus' legs were not broken on the cross. We talk about Jesus being pierced for our transgressions, which he literally was pierced at the end. When he was pierced, both blood and water flowed out of him immediately. Now, I did a little like research, and medical explanations suggest that the intense physical trauma of scourging and crucifixion likely caused a buildup of fluid around his heart and lungs, which would explain the observed flow of blood and water. I mean, doesn't this remind you of how it would just be described that if the woman was guilty, that her belly would swell? And the other curse was that the thigh would waste away. The word for waste away or rot is napheo, which is most commonly translated as fall. It's interesting to note that on the cross, people typically die from suffocation because they can't hold themselves up anymore. That's why they broke the legs of the thieves next to Jesus, so that they couldn't hold themselves up, so that they could suffocate and finally die. Now, the process of crucifixion caused excruciating pain, muscle cramps, numbness, and eventual paralysis in the legs due to exhaustion and loss of blood. Jesus was already dead. He had died before the other two had died. His legs, I believe his legs failed. And remember though, what was different between him and the two next to him is, remember, he had been he was having flesh torn out of him. He was beat before he was put on that cross. So he was already losing blood, and and under all this duress, and we don't know. We don't know how much of his flesh from his legs was torn off, how much muscle was torn off. But we know there was that cat and nine tails, which literally ripped off flesh, could cause your thigh to waste away. Isn't it interesting that we see what the curse was from the Sota ritual? We kind of see it here. In Jesus, God channels his holy jealousy not into wrath alone, but also into redemptive love. He takes the initiative to restore the relationship, even at the cost of his own son. And in the crucifixion, Jesus takes the certainty of our guilt upon himself, even though he is innocent, and absorbs the curse so that we may receive blessing and reconciliation with God. As we enter this week, let's be mindful of that, mindful of how much God loves us, how special we are to God. And with that, I leave you. I pray that you have a blessed week. Shabbat Shalom.